warm greetings to all of you. Welcome to First Unitarian Church in Salt Lake City, where the weather is finally starting to feel like autumn. We finally got that crisp coolness that makes you feel just alive and full of energy, and I hope you're taking advantage of these wonderful circumstances. I just have three quick announcements pertaining to our wonderful church community here. The first has to do with a very unusual hosting that our church will be doing in light of the coming presidential election. The election will be held, as I know you all know, on Tuesday, November 3rd. On Wednesday, November 4th, we are going to hold an open house Zoom meeting from 6 to 9 p.m. This will be a chance to come in, go out as you wish, listen to others comment about the election, a time to vent, a time to laugh, a time to pray. And we will also have a worship service actually it's going to be more like a Vesper service, and that's going to run from 7:30 to 8 o'clock on that Wednesday night. So when you're free and you want to connect with your dear friends from the church community, please do so, 6 to 9, and the link will be available on our website and also in our newsletter, The Torch. The second announcement is again another reminder that our history of this church from 1991 on to the present has been completed. It's been a fantastic joint effort with Marriott Library. It is an online history, and the link to this new edition of our history can also be found on our website as well as in the Torch. And finally, I want to just say thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you who, although not present here in the church, remember to keep up with your pledges. It's been an enormous help. I think you all realize that church expenses are not exempt during this COVID period, and a deep appreciation for those who have kept up with the pledges. And this also serves as a reminder, in case you haven't quite kept up, please, we can certainly use your financial help during these strained times. I'd like to light the chalice now, a wonderful tradition of Unitarian Universalism throughout the world, actually. Last time I said it was just through the country. It is throughout the world. And so I'd like to light the chalice at this time. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
This summer, I was lucky enough to study religious humanism as part of a Unitarian Universalist history class. It was in that study that I learned about John Dietrich. Dietrich was a Unitarian minister from Minneapolis who preached with passion about humanism. This is my favorite quote of his. Our religious humanism teaches us that our faith needs to be placed in the power of humanity. If we live in a great impersonal universe with no friend to guide, it matters tremendously how we conduct ourselves, for we are actually the makers of our destiny. It is our responsibility to put beauty in the place of ugliness, good in place of evil, laughter in place of tears, to dispel error with knowledge, hatred with love, displace strife and contention with peace and cooperation. Today, for our Time for All Ages, I have a book to share with you. that, while it has a bit of fantasy, illustrates this idea of religious humanism nicely. It's called The Extra Yarn, and it's written by Mac Barnett and illustrated by John Clausen.
On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either white of snow or black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turns out he was. And even after she'd made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet!" shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone! Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit a sweater for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible!" said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton, and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louis. She made sweaters for everyone, except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat, and even then Annabelle still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats, and for the other animals too. Soon people thought Annabelle will run out of yarn, but it turned out she didn't. And so Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even need sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from around the world to see the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. One day, an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabelle. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I am willing to offer you $1,000,000. "No, thank you," said Annabelle, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. $2,000,000, he said. Annabelle shook her head. "No thanks." $10,000,000, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabelle. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night, the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box. And they took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box and he lifted its lid and he looked inside. His mustache quivered. It shivered. It trembled. The archduke hurled the box out the window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." But it turned out she was. The end.
I like this book because I think it represents Dietrich's point brilliantly. It's up to us to look for the good. It's up for us to make things beautiful. It's up to us to take care of each other. In this great impersonal universe, we are responsible for each other. May it be so.
Believing in human goodness is not in high fashion these days. In fact, I've talked to many of you in the past few weeks and have heard from you that one of the biggest things you're struggling with right now is losing your faith in humanity. Everything from the condition of our democracy and the frenzy leading up to the election to the latest pleas from the state epidemiologist decrying the lack of cooperation with public health guidelines on the part of state residents. These things are disheartening, and they can lead us to the depressing conclusion that human beings are just no good. Selfish, stubborn, arrogant, greedy, humans can be so disappointing. Now, that belief is having an effect on our mental health, and so it's worth taking time to examine it. None of our beliefs are quite true, said the famous atheist Bertrand Russell. All have at least a penumbra of vagueness and error. What a comfort that is to me. No belief that we hold need limit our imagination nor our actions. One is always capable of changing one's mind, even of coming to the exact opposite conclusion that one is most tenderly holding inside. Humanism has given two premises that have given me a lot of hope over the years. First, that human beings are basically good at heart. And second, that human beings can solve human problems. And actually, science backs up those suppositions with over 40 years of social science research demonstrating that, by and large, human beings are hardwired for compromise, connection, and kindness, and feel best when we're working together. All around you, there are people doing good. The grocery bagger who puts your eggs and potato chips on top, the barista making foam ferns on your latte just because it's pretty, the stranger at the gas station who reminds you not to drive off with your coffee cup on top of your car, your spouse, your tech-savvy coworker, your child's teacher, your child. Kindness does not have to be big to be real. Small kindnesses are the covalent bonds that keep our species rooted to the earth and bound to each other. And what we pay attention to grows. Do you still believe in human goodness, even if other people think it's hopelessly naive? Do you want to believe? Well, one way we can restore our belief in human kindness is to engage in kind actions ourselves. If it occurs to you to do something kind for someone else, let yourself do it right away before you have a chance to overthink it. If someone crosses your mind, pick up the phone and call them. Leave a message if you have to. Send a text or put a card in the mail. Move your neighbors' Amazon boxes off their porch for them, or help them dig their car out of the snowbanks. Leave a 5-star review for your Grubhub delivery person. Or why not make a few phone calls to your elected officials and advocate on behalf of someone you love, and then call them and let them know about it. And don't forget to open your heart and accept kindness from others when it comes your way. Kindness is contagious. Love is nearer than you think. It's in our nature to be kind. It's in your nature to be kind. So if you have a choice, why not choose to see the good in people? My prayer for you this week is that circumstances will conspire to reveal the goodness of humanity to you, and that you will be inspired to return the universe's favor. Amen.
12 pamphlets. That's all it was. 12 pamphlets distributed by evangelical Protestants 100 years ago in 1920. These 12 pamphlets solidified a movement that identified the fundamentals of Christianity. These 12 pamphlets delineated the truth as it attacked modernist theories on biblical criticism. Our Salt Lake Church's very first minister, David Utter, who studied at that radical seminary at Harvard, came to Salt Lake City in 1891 all charged up about biblical criticism which he unleashed on an unsuspecting city. Oh, those Unitarians, even from the beginning, challenging conventional modalities of religion with the litmus tests of reason, science, and conscience. The idea that the Bible did not represent the authoritative Word of God made some inroads in society until the evangelicals had enough of all this ungodliness, and they got serious about the fundamentals of Christianity. 12 pamphlets constituted their attack on the rise of secularism. And as you can well imagine, science and religion were deemed incompatible by the fundamentalists. The big issue at that time was evolution, and the Scopes monkey trial was still 5 years away. Science was under assault in this new wave of fundamentalism, but opposition to a belief in a supernatural being looking down upon us from the heavens was not necessarily a novel idea. Now, there have always been doubters going back to the very beginnings of Christianity, but they were dealt with swiftly. They were executed for peddling their heresy. But then, 1892, Nietzsche's madman rattled society by pronouncing, "God is dead." The news had not yet reached the ears of man, he exclaimed, but the result of God's death will turn faith away from a deity and finally embrace, or better yet, tap into all the potential within human beings. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, we essentially had two brands of Christianity: the evangelicals on the one hand and the modernists on the other. The modernists were liberal Christians who accepted the advancement of science, and yet they tried to straddle science with a religious sensibility, upholding a belief in God. Liberal Christians were not about to surrender Christian language and terminology to the fundamentalists, so they included traditional language in worship, albeit a little watered down. Mainstream Unitarianism fell mostly in line with this, allowing for a rational mind to temper any kind of religious fervor. What was obviously missing, obvious in retrospect, was a need for liberal Christians to break away entirely from the shadows of orthodoxy and to develop a new following that would refuse to equivocate when it came to placing science front and center. The huge implication in doing so meant that humanity, not divinity, had the responsibility for shaping the future welfare of this world. It was our world, not God's. And only the scientific method would ultimately lead us to the truth we all sought. And so by 1913, two Unitarian ministers, John Dietrich and Curtis Reese, were developing a humanist philosophy, which matured by 1916. The centerpiece of this was a belief and trust in the human effort, which offered a solid and reliable contrast to any measure of theism. Even the liberal modernists were too religious for this new alignment of rational religion. So humanists began with this huge pronouncement of everything it did not believe. In fact, it was Dietrich who made it very clear that he denied the infallibility of the Bible. He denied the virgin birth, the deity of Jesus, the efficacy of atonement. It makes you kind of wonder what's left of religion. And this is where humanists made, in my opinion, huge contribution towards integrating the progress of science into a new moral way of being without God. By 1920, humanism became more attractive to many Unitarians, especially outside of New England. And one such humanist, the Reverend Leon Burkhead, took his bold religious thinking to the pulpit of the Unitarian Church in Kansas City. He was a character. Originally a Methodist minister in rural Illinois, he realized that his Methodist days were numbered when he held beauty contests on the lawn of the Methodist Church. He wisely then moved to the Unitarian ministry. Now, during the early 1920s, in the midst of a huge drought in Kansas City, and of course affecting all the farmland surrounding the big city, the ministers in town held an outdoor prayer meeting for rain, for the blessed rain to bless the parched earth. Burkhead was the only minister who attended the prayer meeting with an umbrella. And he later chastised his colleagues on their lack of faith. In 1926, the great writer Sinclair Lewis made his way to Kansas City in order to research the ministry, to really flush out what ministers were really all about, because he was working on his infamous fictional character, Elmer Gantry. Now, although Sinclair Lewis met with all the clergy in Kansas City, he became fast friends with Leon Burkhead, because one thing was Leon's humor, and the second reason was Leon was the only minister who would let Sinclair Lewis smoke in his presence. Now, the larger group of traditional ministers, and Sinclair Lewis and Leon Burkhead would regularly get together to discuss hellfire and brimstone preaching, damnation, all those exciting things that we associate with fundamentalist ministers. And they would all really get into the spirit of things with prayers and hymn singing, and soon it became quite a spectacle. Outside guests would show up on occasion, and one such day, who would appear but Clarence Darrow, who I figure maybe needed some prayers after his ordeal following the Scopes trial. But the most remarkable part about the friendship between Sinclair Lewis and Leon Burkhead is that a humanist minister is responsible for shaping the evangelical character Elmer Gantry in the novel by the same name. It was Leon who helped the author understand the, well, shall we say, the seamier side of the ministry. And he must have done a really good job, because in 1930, Sinclair Lewis became the very first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 1960, Burt Lancaster starred in the movie Elmer Gantry. So imagine this. Without a humanist minister from Kansas City, there may never have been an Elmer Gantry. Well, of course, humanism made far more contributions than serving as a resource for Sinclair Lewis. Some of the basic tenets of humanism were formalized as follows: the need to show love to all human beings. Don't you hear echoes of that in our first principle today? The need to show love to all human beings. Immortality is found in the examples we set and the work we do. We gain insight from many sources and cultures. We have the power within ourselves to realize the best we are capable of as human beings. And finally, we are responsible for what we do and what we become. And these ideas were really set in a more formal way in the Humanist Manifesto, which was written in 1933, a difficult year when you think about it for placing one's faith in human potential. The Great Depression loomed large at the time, and the evil stirrings of Adolf Hitler were just beginning to be known. But if the thrust of humanism lay in the steadfast belief that history is controlled by human hands and not by the intervention of a supernatural God, humanism could not have picked a more difficult time to express their point of view. Ed Wilson, who served as minister to our church from 1946 to 1949, was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. Calling him to the ministry in this church confirmed that the commitment of our congregation at that time was fully steeped in humanism. After his career, Ed returned to Salt Lake City, and he was in his late 80s by then, and he lived in Friendship Manor. My conversations with him were truly some of the highlights of my ministry. Ed died at the age of 92, still very alert and bright, sharp as a tack, as they say. And another signer of the Humanist Manifesto, Lester Mondale, came here to Salt Lake to join me in celebrating Ed's life. Lester Mondale was Walter Mondale's brother, for those who remember Walter Mondale's campaign for the presidency. See, there you go again. 6 degrees of separation. Can't get away from it. The idea of abandoning all traces of traditional religious language, which is what really separated humanists from mainstream Unitarianism, had a sobering impact on my ministry. First, let me make it clear that the humanists' message struggled quite a bit at times when there were not just difficult situations, but real crises. For example, as an empirically based, sophisticated religion with no reference whatsoever to the transcendent, we will find very little comfort in the Humanist Manifesto in how they treated very large existential experience of suffering. In fact, the manifesto states, and I will quote, "Man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. Now, of course, that was kind of a sign of the times back in the 30s, but still just the concept that if there's a crisis, you really need to man up, or as they say, acquiring manly attitudes. That's what's going to help you through a crisis. I have some difficulty with that. In my years as a New England Unitarian minister, I would occasionally use theological terms which apparently were just loaded for humanists. I would say God, for example, figuring everyone had their own concepts. But just the word, and even the word spiritual, sent one family in my Waltham congregation, sent them right out of the church forever, deeply, deeply angered with me. Ironically, I always considered myself a humanist, at least back then, but words, as we know, can be highly charged. So this family had been gone from the church, about 2 years, maybe 3, when I received a call from one of the daughters, who was now in her mid-20s, telling me that her mother was in the hospital with a brain aneurysm. The mom was in a vegetative state. I expressed my sorrow. And then she told me that they were going to pull the plug that very afternoon and asked if I would come to the ICU and offer a prayer. Whew. Let me tell you, a million things raced through my mind, but it was as though this young woman knew what was going on internally for me. She said, you know, the line between life and death is pretty powerful. It's like being, and I'm always going to remember these words, it's like being in the twilight of uncertainty. Being in the twilight of uncertainty. Well, I went up and I prayed with the family in the hospital, officiated the memorial service, and never saw anyone in that family ever again. The crisis had passed. I assume that the family, like most humanists, returned to the sophistication of a more intellectual, that is, empirical religious expression that wrapped itself in cynicism towards anything that even allowed for the, what I'd call the poetry of religious language. Recalling, though, the twilight of uncertainty, I remember receiving a call from a frantic humanist family from Michigan who were traveling through Utah. Grandpa, on this road trip, became deathly ill. He's in the hospital, the son screamed at me, and he said, we have to save Grandpa from the Mormons before he dies. I didn't know what on earth he was talking about. And then in a little further conversation with him, I understood that his impression of the Mormons was akin to how we perceive QAnon these days. I was asked to go with the family up to University Hospital to rescue Grandpa from the Mormons. When we got up there, Grandpa was right on the cusp between life and death, being cradled in the arms of an African-American nurse who was singing to him some beautiful, warm, gentle, soft gospel tunes. And Grandpa's expression on his face was complete and utter contentment. And so this humanist family stood around the bedside and they kind of shuffled a bit. They couldn't believe their eyes. I mean, the family patriarch who led them to humanism in the first place was on his way now to heaven, accompanied by the singing of black spirituals. Well, we can't really predict much in life, can we? You know, there was a time when we thought we simply had to put ourselves into a theological box and label it. Theist, deist, humanist, agnostic, atheist. What did that accomplish? You know, it doesn't feel like we're so inclined to do that anymore. I've come to realize, I think, that ultimately the reason that we gather in a church community is not that we bring our little labels and boxes with us, but we come together in order to learn to live our lives with humility and to cultivate a profound sense of gratitude. Now, I use the word humility because your life, like mine, is an unaccountable blessing. What a gift we receive through grace, that is, a gift not of our own doing. The gift of simply inhaling a breath of life and feeling the wondrousness of it all. We differ only in what we call the source of this gift. And in our far too busy lives, we easily lose track of what is really important, like feeling gratitude for the mysteries of love and kindness and the natural splendor that graciously sweeps us up in this intricate interconnectedness of all of life. All of life. There we are. How did we get here? What a gift to be a part of this cosmos. Now, I began my ministry as a hardcore humanist, never ever giving a thought to prayer during a service. And when the dearth of prayer and spiritual matters were brought to my attention as a young minister, I responded with all the superiority of a rational elite intellectual. "Oh," said the man in my congregation, I thought it might be nice just to take a little time to notice." Notice. Well, from then on, I purposefully began to take time to notice during worship, during the course of my life. It really turned things around for me immensely. Now, humanism isn't really a factor anymore in contemporary Unitarian Universalism or really anywhere in society. Its history is magnificent in its persuasive campaign to ensure that religion not lose its footing in the rational world, that we are ultimately responsible for the fate of this world, and thus placing social justice as one of our spiritual mainsprings. Humanism assured us we can be fine, moral people without a God keeping tabs on us. Humanism influenced Unitarian Universalism in a most positive way. It taught a unique perspective on human beings as possessing dignity and elegance that they had rarely been afforded in religious circles. But over time, the bridge connecting science and religion had become well established throughout, many denominations. Pushing rational thought in religion was no longer a novel experience. It was accepted. It was absorbed pretty widely, not only by Unitarians. Now, it feels these days that we are less and less in any theological confrontations. Goodness, even the evangelicals with their notorious style of religion are beginning to see climate disaster as lying beyond God's reach. So we come to church, I believe, not to safeguard rational thought, but to regard the world with love and to be bold in our pursuit of its repair. We want to hold up justice as a means of strengthening the tenuous bonds among people. And we want to be sure we notice the splendor of the cosmos that we somehow find ourselves in. And we are growing more comfortable in regarding all of this as an encounter with the holy. Nobody gets up and leaves the church anymore at the mention of holy or sacred or spiritual. So I think this is now where we have arrived. It's been quite a journey, but I think we're there. Amen. As we extinguish this chalice, may we receive and give these gifts and blessings. A word of welcome to the stranger, a heart of warmth for all whom we meet, a thought of gladness for those whom we love, a moment of quiet grace for our souls, a strong hope for every day. May we receive these gifts and blessings. May we give them to others as well. Amen.